So I guess you're pretty well ready to lay up your bike for the season.
I actually already did.
Already,
Yeah,
good.
yeah, taking the bus.
Oh, good. I had one up to 4 years ago, a little black Vespa, and I live a little bit away from here. I used to drive it in. You probably remember it, a little black thing, and used to have great fun with it. I used to go by the guys on their Harleys and give them that low sign and see them just cringe when I went by. And you get a lot of smiles on little Vespas as you drive around the campus. Some old fart driving on a Vespa.
Yeah.
But I was getting too old, had to get rid of it.
Yeah.
Anyway, this is Brian MacDonald. Chaucy to you folks out there, but I thought you'd just like to meet Chaucy. Wind beneath their wings. He does so much around here to make this wouldn't be possible without these guys doing this off the side of the desk. It's not in their job description. So I thought we'd all just like to say hello to Chaucy for a few minutes. And it was Jerry Kelly said, one of our first presidents of this institution, said that the faculty were kind of like, what's that Tom Cruise's movie, Top Guns, that we were sort of the pilots and flying, but we couldn't stay in the air without Brian and folks in the program office and folks like that below that keep us flying. And so I want to thank you for doing this for us, and much appreciated.
Yeah, no problem.
Good man. Good man.
Yeah.
Thanks, Brian, very much. Well, you met Chaucy. Does so much around here for us. Just wanted to introduce him to you. Well, this is our last session. Mixed feelings, of course, as we wrap it all up, but I'm sure you have the same sort of things. Happy to be through it. But having said that, this is session 8. It's the Waterfall Method. I try to wrap up the course here for you. It's the process that I use in crafting strategy, but understand strategy is not linear, even though the Waterfall Method kind of suggests it is. If you've got an existing one, you're zooming in and out all the time, tweaking and adjusting based on what's happening with the water in the bathtub. But if you've got a blank piece of paper, I commend the Waterfall Method as one process that you might follow. We start that process with the 3 C's, that little video clip that we talk in terms of the company, the competitors, and our customers, and populate those 3 spheres with all the data, modeling, information you can find. Get all the data in there and dump it on the table, trying to identify clearly that little A sweet spot that is going to be your area, your terrain that you're going to defend, and based on that, you'll write your vision, your mission, and focus on that little square as we do it. I also sent you out a template, a strategic business plan, template, marketing plan. It suits a number of purposes. You just have to go through the different headings in there, select the ones that are appropriate to you. And in each of those headings, I have given some suggested tools from the little red toolbox that you might consider using to support that particular entry part into your plan. Your papers, I'll have them back to you by Friday, hopefully a little sooner. Feedback is certainly there. I'm very pleased with the grades coming out. Everybody's doing well at this stage. I still have quite a way to go, but having said that, you'll find that the feedback, I forget how many pages I've got. I think about 20 pages of feedback for each of you. A lot of it is boilerplate, but I wanted you to have the full Monty to see all these things spelled out, what you could do as a consultant if you're doing this, or if you have your OMP. Both the template and this full feedback on a case study will give you a sense what you could write up as a consultant in OMPs or working for actually getting paid for a living doing this sort of work. The exam, of course, is a closed book. As I said, the time you open this on Monday, I will send you the actual case that you'll be getting on the exam. They'll give you the balance of week 8 and those days leading up to the exam the following week to sit with your colleagues, kick it around, identify what the cases happen to, the questions might be, and then when you go into the exam, the purpose is just to bring the stress level down. You'll still have to work hard and demonstrate to me you understand the concepts and notions, but some people write exams well, other people get quite tense about it, so I don't want to put undue pressure on if I don't have to. Interesting, Trump today, say what you like or dislike about him, but the fact is the economy down there, the stock market down there, the unemployment down there, all the figures are looking outstanding. The GNP just came out for the third quarter again in excess of 3. I think it's 3.3%. And that's up from about 1.5% when the Obama administration left. And each point contributes just about enough to cover the extra spending on the tax cut. And so if they can hold at 3.3, the spending they're doing that's offset by the tax cuts is just about a wash at this point. And if he can do better, and I believe he can, I think they can get to 4 anyway. Which is not a big number. They've done it in the past. That would put America well on the road of good recovery coming back, and that, of course, is good for Canada, because Ontario, Montreal, etc., are so involved with economic interdependence with Americans, so that's good. Bitcoins, interesting. Certainly they've raised their head. We talked about that early on in this course, and I think since we talked early on in this course, they've gone up about $8,000 in the span of X number of weeks. Today they hit a high of $11,000 and then settled back down to 9,000, I think. But certainly to countries like Venezuela and other countries, they don't have the real banking infrastructure as we're kind of accustomed to in Canada and in Europe and our American friends to the south. But in other nations, it's a welcome alternative. They don't have to go through, they don't have these wide currency things they have to deal with. Bankers don't make a piece coming through. The credit cards they use back and forth don't take 1.5 points off for debit cards and credit cards. They just use Bitcoins. And there's an appetite for them. They're growing. In fact, I think in this course we've talked that the American government and the British government have both implemented their own Bitcoin processes, but they control what happens, who gets it, and how, and track all your expenditures in and out. And say what you want about that. EU expansion. I want to talk today in something that's popped up on our Horizon. I've been watching it now for a number of months, but increasingly we talk about Chinese using the not chess but go as their method of expansion, soft and gentle, but nevertheless just constant push coming on. And they've done that down the Gold Coast of Australia, down the Gold Coast of South America. The Caribbean is primarily Chinese have taken over. In Africa, great inroads in many African nations the Chinese are doing. And now they've, recent last couple of years, but increasingly, they're becoming very active in those old European countries down to where Tito used to have the Yugoslavia. Those countries are all Croatia. Those countries are all right now. Yes, they're part of the European Union, but they're not entirely happy with the European Union. In fact, they're using as a bargaining chip their growing relationship with China. China, as part of their Silk Road, and ends up in Budapest, one of the key cities coming over that way. Those European countries feel that they're not getting the support that they're entitled to or expected from the European Union, from Brussels. And so they're very much welcoming this Chinese involvement and growing influence that China has. And China has agreed to spend something like 10 billion euros in the last year or two just to improve the infrastructure and roads and things of that nature. And so we see with the, that's what Sun Tzu's, not Sun Tzu, but in our course we talk in terms of strategies on when to attack. And here we have a competitor who's down. The European Union has got a lot on its plate to deal with right now with these percolating starts of Austria with the free right-wing sort of side of the house, the other percolating spots of growing nationalism in some of the nations, not everywhere, but some of them. Certainly the Britain with Brexit is a concern coming up, and how that's all going to, with the divorce, divide up the relationship. And it's the time to attack, and China recognizes that, and China is using this split, this hemorrhage, to come in and watch for it. It's called the 16 plus 1, 16 plus 1, 16 countries plus 1, and they're making some inroads. I'll talk some more about that for a few minutes. OPEC, Saudi got together the other day and has agreed to, for another 9 months, to artificially constrain the demand-supply curve for oil in the world with an effort to maintain oil prices high, gas prices high. They normally produce about 10.8 million barrels a day. They said they'd drop it to less than 10 million barrels a day. I think the globe totally is around 85 million barrels a day. And we'll see how that works. But certainly a success that there seems to be agreement that they'll continue it on. So my papers, I have Greece is interesting, a little tidbit, but Greece next to Turkey, part of the common border up there. We talk about the Kurds down below, but what we have here is the Muslims in that area are still using Shia law for dealing with family affairs and things of that nature. And the Greeks have come out with this extra stress of immigration and one thing or another, saying, henceforth going forward, there will be no Shia law. Not trying to be too hard, not trying to abolish here, but they're saying that as far as they're concerned, it should be a matter of free choice of the people, other than they have to follow that religion. So it's just some pushback is starting in Greece. Outsourcing is interesting in the last mile. Certainly Amazon, I think we all watched this Black Friday and Monday that they've had. I think somewhere I read the report that Amazon hit 52% of all online sales. 52% of all online sales were Amazon's, and they're forecasting that will rise in the near future to 70% of all online sales. And that has some number of implications to that. First, it seems to me when I call them the four companies of the apocalypse, that when these countries get to this sort of size and stature, they've passed what capitalism is all about. They've now entered the world almost of monopolies in their own area. And that's not capitalism, and they need to be looked at and controlled or broken up a little bit. And we should talk a bit about what happens not today, but 5 years from now, if the trend continues for these four large companies, should the state step in? And I'm right-wing until the Hun, but these folks aren't capitalists at that point. They're monopolies, and with monopolies, it destroys innovation because they don't have to innovate. There's nobody breathing down their necks anymore. They have the wherewithal to stamp out any startups that try to get off the ground. They can bring unfair pressure on the suppliers, as we've seen with Walmart and people like that. They really are hard on suppliers, and we could talk a little bit about that side of it. So that's one issue that pops into mind. But the other thing that came out of that is the growth of all the little startups, the FedEx and the Canada Post and people like this. Amazon has harnessed the energies and has encouraged new little startups for same-day delivery. In fact, 56% of respondents aged 16 to 25 say that they'd deal with Amazon if they could do the same delivery. But they said if they couldn't do same day, 25% of them would be less inclined to deal with Amazon. They want that instant gratification, the millennials, as they do it. And so companies like Postmart, Instacart, and others, that last mile delivery in the chain, wonderful opportunities, but a threat to Canada Post, a threat to FedEx, and these new ones is a chance to get off. And that supports the notion in this class, only the quick and the dead, and we need to run paranoid because your competitor is just a new startup, sees the opportunity, and is pushing like mad to exploit it. I talked about China's 16+1, the Silk Road. They're meeting again very shortly to keep pushing this relationship closer, and it's something we should look for. China's come out with a new policy. By 2030, they hope to become the world leader in artificial intelligence. And they've funded it. At the end of the day, they'll have $148 billion. And remember, with the purchasing power parity, that money buys a lot more in China than it does if America was to spend $148 billion. But anyway, they're going to have first mover advantage. They want to be the premier global artificial innovator center by 2030. They have the new framework that they're going to advance 3-in-1 agenda. First, they're going to tackle all key problems on research and development. Second, they're going to pursue a range of products and applications. And third, they're going to cultivate an artificial intelligence industry. And for those watching on robots and things of this nature, you can certainly see them daily making quantum leaps in this area. And that's not a bad thing. I mean, we have talked in our course about Porter's model on why nations are competitive, and here's China's doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing: advanced factor endowments. It's putting money into R&D to grow the skill sets, the education, the technology folks that do this work. They're growing these to get ready, and we should pause for a minute and say, what's Canada doing? Because if we don't, we're going to be left in the dust. Anyway, today's paper, let's push on with that. North Korea, well, yesterday, by the time you read this on Monday, it's old news, but they fired off another missile and 3 small ones. Certainly, Trump says he's going to deal with it. And it's interesting, the paper today and part of the fine print, apparently, I don't know why, but for the first time, the foreign ministers of the nations who are involved in the Korean conflict, recall, we just have a truce. The war is still going on, theoretically, between NATO and North Korea, and we had a truce on the DMZ there, the 38th parallel. Canada is hosting, and America, of course, will be part of that. But all the other nations involved in NATO are getting together in Canada very shortly, and I'm just wondering if that's not an opportunity to say the truce is over. And from the Americans' optics point of view, it's not the Americans bringing this charge, but it's, again, the United Nations. It's Canada and the folks who were involved in the heavy slogging during the Korean crisis may well be asked to step back in and refill up the lines again. And we've talked a bit about the Princess Patricia Light Infantry and their involvement in that and Capion Hill during this course. So that's interesting. Trump today has put a naval blockade to stop all the ships coming and going into North Korea. Last week they tightened down the screws on the sanctions. Their economy is small. They've only got about a $30 billion economy, and the fellow who runs Amazon, of course, has got a net worth over $100 billion. So you get a sense how small the economy is there, and the screws are tightening. I think a lot of this is in the ball court of China and what role they're going to play. And if they don't step up, I'm convinced that Trump at this point will see if he couldn't reactivate the old guard that was once there in 1952 and 1953 and bring them forward again. In any event, our Prime Minister Trudeau is asked to delay his China talks with the Premier Xi about free trade between the two countries, and it's all in part of a couple of parents of a Canadian citizen who had entrepreneurial skills, went back and forth regularly. He was part of the Royal Bank of Canada's top 25 Canadian Immigrant Award winners in 2015. So he was somebody who's contributing well to Canada. And he and his wife were held, and have been for about 20 months now, in China. And so there's more pressure on our government, the line is here, if your government cannot protect and defend honest Canadian business people in China today, how will you be able to protect and defend honest Canadian people doing business in China after we have this free trade agreement? So the argument is don't do the free trade agreement until you get these people released. And keep in mind that it was only 2 weeks ago that Trump, on such a similar visit to Premier Xi, was able to get 3 basketball players who stole goods from a set of stores and had them out of there and heading home. So this will be the same sort of clout with the Chinese. Loans, this is an interesting thing, the housing costs. We talked in Vancouver and Toronto and Victoria and rising up. But the Bank of Canada is, notwithstanding you've been qualified with 20% down to get a home, they're saying, no, you have to do better than that as well. That if the interest rates were to go up 2 percentage points, would you still fit within that formula to have you provided a mortgage? If you can't meet that stress test of a 2% rise in interest rates, you'll not get your mortgage in Canada. And the hammer's coming down on that. Well, the ripple effect of that, the impact on that through young couples working, trying to get their first home, and coupled with the initiatives by municipalities on these, rent out a house and we're going to charge you, and I think it was $2,500 a year to register your home for this sort of purposes. It's getting very tight to find a home. At a time we have 0 vacancy rates on business properties, anyway. Certainly in Vancouver and Victoria. So we watch for that. Supreme Court judge, expect it might be a woman. Normally it rotates, we said, on and off, male, female. Last week we said, well, maybe it's time to have a Chinese barrister or a Sikh barrister or an Irish, some other nationality step forward and let them have a turn at bat. The Irish Deputy Prime Minister resigns to avoid an election threat, some sort of misdeed going on behind, but rather than have an election, Frances stepped down, and there'll be no action. But watch for Prime Minister May from Britain to secure her coalition. She paid money to and got the support of the 6 members from Ireland, and I wonder if there's any impact will flow out of that. CSIS, our security agency in Ottawa, has been quietly capturing phone identification data from terrorist suspects without judicial knowledge or oversight. They've just been tapping phones of people getting phone calls from the Middle East or from Europe or other places that they believe to be terrorists. And of course, if you happen to be on the other line, what you've said goes into this big pot for data mining. And the question becomes, had there been data mining, not just that call, but other things on this side, data mining for looking for other issues, much like we see Mueller doing in the States with this inquiry into President Trump on Russian involvement. And is that a right thing to do? Is there, how important are your civil liberties to you? I mean, what authority does the state have to look at your, listen to your phones? You're entitled to certain civil liberties, certain rights, inalienable rights that you have, and increasingly they're slipping and ebbing away. And we're quiet, like frogs boiling in a bucket of water. We just don't feel the heat, and it's happening. Ottawa's not to blame for newspapers closing. This was interesting, but it's not a surprise. It's what we've been talking about in this course with the new industrial age. But if I read this correctly, there's been 291 full-time and part-time jobs gone. 41 newspapers have closed across Canada, to include the Toronto Star is one, I guess, that's going down. And they've established a $75 million a year fund for magazines and non-daily newspapers that the government doles out, $75 million. And it occurred to me, one, of course, no big surprise, digital newspapers, that's how people are getting the news today. Very few people like to get ink on their fingers, except a few of us old farts. So not a surprise. So to what extent should you, the Canadian taxpayer, be supporting picking winners and losers as to which paper gets a donation from our tax dollars and which ones don't get support? And then think for a minute the criteria for that support. To what extent is the $75 million doled out to papers that are supportive of the government's position? If you're anti-government, do you think you get the same share of that $75 million? So we want to look at that. I didn't even know that existed, but they've got this $75 million a year they give out to magazines and daily newspapers. And I'd be curious to know what the criteria is. But again, no big surprise. Rental market strains, survey says. And the rental, it's bedroom rents for a two-bedroom in Vancouver's jumped 22%. In Nelson, the vacancy rate is almost zero. Vancouver's almost zero. Most are less than 1%. In BC, the finance minister is happy. We've got a $52 billion budget in BC, and extra revenue seems to be coming in this year, so they're doing well. Sobeys slashing 800 office jobs as part of the grocery chain reorganization. Sobeys, of course, have done some acquisitions, mergers and acquisitions across Canada, to include Thrifty's here on this coast, and was a local supplier. But like Loblaws, the largest producer in Canada, they're experiencing just what we've been talking about, the Walmart and the Googles, though haven't quite started this far north yet in any big way, but this online grocery shopping, the changes in how we buy our groceries, it's impacting these people as we go through it. And all that comes with the with these loss of jobs. Again, the retail space, what are we going to do with all this retail space that's popping up? And it has to be something of an entertainment basis. I mean, the West Edmonton Mall, people go there almost on vacation to swim in the swimming pool and see it, and while you're swimming, Dad or Mom says, I'll just dip up over here and do some shopping. But in the absence of some sort of gravity to pull you to that center, these places are going to be barns as Sears and others close down. What's in this one? Scotiabank. Well, oil prices are down to $57 roughly. Gold's up to under $1,300. Our Canadian dollar's about 78. At one point during the course, I think it got to 81 fluctuation. Luxury lounges, Air Canada. We talked a bit about last week. They shows these lovely lounges now with nice drinks and nice little snackies put out. Toronto Pearson International is one of the first ones to open the new lounge, and all to attract the business travelers, etc. The ones, I guess, that have the money to pay for this. But again, that's that experiential model to say, fly with us because we're a nice experience. We got nice comfy seats, private away from the horde, and they're trying to promote that way. Maybe the malls have to do the same thing. Certainly BC Ferries in this province, rather than just like the Coho, a straight ride back and forth, they've made these destination centers that you spend 2 hours on the tarmac looking at all little shops and stores while they take their pennies from you. Canada takes the softwood fight to the World Trade Organization. We've been there before, and most often we win. But the Americans can't be happy with that, but To our credit, we're now taking it to the World Trade Organization and try to get a ruling as to whether or not these additional taxes the Americans have charged our lumber industry in Canada are fair. TransCanada engages landowners on the Keystone Pipeline route. It's in excess of $8 billion U.S. Capital expenditure. They're going to have a decision sometime in December whether they'll go ahead with it or not. And they do about 800,000 barrels a day is anticipated to go through the pipeline. And of course, we've had that discussion whether the capital cost for this size thing is warranted. Canada is ready for domestic free trade. Yeah, this isn't increasingly. You may not be aware that we say we're a free trading nation. We want free trade with other nations, but we don't have free trade just with each other's provinces. From Alberta to BC, trucks have different width sizes. They're allowed to have the lights on and things of this nature. So these barriers to trade interprovincially we put up, it's something like $20 billion a year. I could stand to be correct in that number, but our economy would be $20 billion a year better off if we could just have free trade between nations, or between provinces. And so things like cigarettes and liquor, you can't go buy if you want to buy a car, they first thing they ask is where's your postal code, so they can find the price for that car according to that postal code. And so it may well be that Alberta at one point didn't have GST. Why couldn't I buy my car in Alberta and drive it to here? It would tend to, free trade would tend to bring the prices down, and it would get this provincial monopoly, if you have, like on liquor, on cigarettes and things of this nature, out of the way. But it's artificially held up, and it's an opinion piece, and I kind of support the notion that time has come for us to have free trade in Canada. Ontario reforms its labour laws in time for the election coming up to a minimum wage of $15. Well, and two reports. One's by the Financial Accountability Office has estimated more than 50,000 people could lose their jobs due to the increase. The TD Bank report estimates a minimum wage hike could cost the provincial economy 90,000 jobs by 2090. And the Ontario Working Coalition concluded 185,000 jobs could be affected. So some of the economists are saying don't do it, but the election's coming as a popular win for the voters, for the elected Liberals to do this. So, what do you think about that $15 a wage? I mean, here we have the retail aid. We just talked about retail stores in the malls are just trying to hang on as all the business is going online, and the doors just don't see the traffic flow. And now they've got an additional overhead cost of $15 an hour for labor, and so it's certainly going to drive, like McDonald's, more of robotics serving the hamburgers and one thing or another, and less people involved. So we can talk a bit about that. Nafta in Canada. Yeah, this was another report done, which I'm trying to remember who did. Two new studies suggested that if we ended the trade deal and ended Nafta with the Americans, our total impact on our GDP would be 0.7, less than 1% off our GDP if we simply said did away with it. And interesting concept. So maybe our negotiators should realize that we could walk away. And I think if the Americans heard a little bit of that in a meaningful way, it may help on things like the lumber accord and the auto content and things we've been discussing. Alberta Premier lands a new job advising the Afghans on energy. You recall the Redford apparently had a 45,000 trip to South African President Nelson Mandela's funeral, and some other charges that people scratched their heads. But it obviously paid off by going, because she's now from United Nations. She's been put on the International Election Commissions, who put her in that job to look at the Afghanistan's energy. So she continues to be at the trough. Aviation industry ready to soar, but is the industry ready? Big numbers here talking about the aviation industry, need for traffic controllers and pilots. They said they need 67 pilots a day for the next 20 years for just about 500,000 new pilot jobs. That's amazing, and I'd have to read that a little closer. This is globally, of course, but with robotics. But it's interesting that it's one of the areas we certainly want to identify as strategists where the new jobs are going to be, those ones that require empathy and critical thinking. It's not going to be the things, the boilerplate stuff you can do by way of repetition. The British banks, our former Canadian Governor Mark Carney over there running the Bank of England has looked at the stress test for the British banks and said we're okay. Even if we had a disorderly exit from the European Union, our banks can withstand the impact, and so that's a positive good news. Trump appoints a federal chair to defend the push to review regulations. Jerome Powell, he's coming in to run the Federal Reserve. He's talking in terms of not really deregulating, but more of continue the same, but they are talking about rising the interest rates a bit south of the border, and so we could watch that. I guess the last thing I wanted to talk about was a little article in here on careers I thought was helpful. I might just take a minute, but it's just advice on leadership, if you would, that teams look to us for guidance most of the time in crisis, and in order to bring about change, we said you need a crisis, or at least a perceived need for change for a crisis, a perceived crisis, to make it happen. You need to line your team behind a vision that inspires them to reach out to their full potential. You have to focus on what you can control. You have to inspire confidence within your teams, and you have to lead by example, lead the charge. And the article goes on a bit more in depth on that, but those are three good tips. And so we reached that end of the time, our close of the session. I hope you've enjoyed these. But a few closing thoughts, if I can. The first thought I have, and I've encouraged you here to carry on with this critical thinking, and to do that, close your doors for 20 minutes a day. Just tell your folks in your office, I need this quiet time to do what we do here, read the paper and reflect upon it a few minutes on what you read in the front page, what you read in the business section, how that all comes about, and the ripples are likely to impact on you. Indeed, it doesn't hurt to carry on one of these smoke-out sessions on your own. Get a couple of friends together, go for a drink some night, and be businessy about it, talk about what's going on. I think I've mentioned in this course that guaranteed success comes from three things. The first is books. Read books. I don't just mean books, but books in the area you're interested in. If it's entrepreneurship, read entrepreneurship books. If it's things on strategy, read strategy books. If it's things on artificial intelligence, read artificial intelligence. And you say, I don't have time, Terry. I hear what you're saying. But suppose you simply gave me 10 minutes a day, 15 minutes a day to read a book. And you take that 10 or 15 minutes times 7 days a week times 31 days in the month, you'll find you get 7 or 8 hours a month. You can read a book a month. If you read 12 books a year on your area, your discipline, you'd be surprised what advantage that would give you, how successful you could become by doing that. The second thing you can do after reading books is to set yourselves goals, like you've done in this course, to say you're going to get your master's in business administration. Continue in life setting those sort of goals with target dates. Meet the specific objectives as if they were objectives. Don't just wander around aimlessly. Set those goals, put timelines on them, and achieve them. And the third thing is to surround yourself with like-minded people, like Silicon Valley. All the people who want to deal with the computer chips and computers tend to gravitate into Silicon Valley, and they go to the same clubs and pubs and swim in the same bathwater and have that same sort of dialogue. And that's what promotes success. So books, goals, and surround yourself with the right people interested in your area, not downers, but people that are interested in what you do. That will drive your bottom line to success. So I leave that thought with you. Your EL2 as lead for strategy, I designed the course. I took the first one through. Great course. Mike Thompson, outstanding instructor. Mike will take you through that, and you're going to really enjoy your EL2. Where you throw everything else away, you just solve a messy problem. Real clients will come in and say, here are my difficulties, and your whole job in life is just come up with some solutions based on all the materials you've covered in the course and make a presentation. It's a lovely thing. You'll really enjoy it. And so finally, I might leave you with the concept that you can't change the wind, but you can certainly reset your sails. Anyway, folks, I hope you enjoyed it. I've enjoyed our time together. Bye now.